One of the subjects I have on this lesson has to do with accidental, and another one has to do with wet in wet. So I'm going to kind of combine these two in this little exercise. And first of all, we're going to do a little wet in wet. And simply take some water and put some water onto the paper and get it nice and wet. This watercolor paper works very nicely for this. It doesn't all wrinkle up. If you wet both the back and the front of the paper, it will lay nice and flat. You can run this over by the sink and run it wet on both sides. Put it on a piece of paper so you don't get the table all wet, and you're good to go. Okay, so now it's laying nice and flat. And let's look at some wet in wet. So wet in wet, what are we doing here? Well, we're working with the idea of what happens when color is introduced at this wet in wet stage. We have combinations here. In this case, we have a combination of wet in wet and combination of it in complementary colors. And obviously, since I haven't planned this at all, you could also say, well, that's also a pretty good example of accidental. Who knows what's going to happen when these colors all run together? You can add another color here if you wish, or you can leave it this way. But let's just put some more intense red in here and see what happens there. It's all, oops, I threw a little orange in there. Oops, let's try it back here again. Let's get that red in here. Okay. And maybe play with the green just a little bit as well. Okay. Once this dries, you can come back in and do some other things. In the meantime, let's say you took the back part of your paintbrush and did a little drawing in here. What happens when you make some designs just with the back of your paintbrush? It makes a little groove in the paper, and then the water and the color tend to flow into that groove that's created. You can go back in here and follow that groove around just a little bit more, make it just a little more intense, and possibly even create some other grooves. Keep playing with it. If you have little puddles here that are kind of building up and you want to get rid of them, wipe your brush off, come in, and it'll soak it right back up again. As a matter of fact, if you wipe your brush off, you can actually come back in and lift some color from here while it's still wet. Just keep wiping your brush and creating some other areas of interest. The brush acts as a little sponge. Speaking of which, you can take your cloth or your Kleenex or your paper and you can blot out some of the water as well and some of the color. This can also be an interesting effect in your design. So this is accidental. It's also complementary, and it's also wet in wet. So you can see where 2 or 3 combinations of these things can come into play.